Conan the Barbarian is an IP that takes place in a time and setting that is so rich and vast that Robert E. Howard easily could have written a whole trilogy of novels comparable to Lord of the Rings. Robert E. Howard obviously wrote plenty of material, even though they might not be specifically a trilogy of novels. It is a collection of short stories that tells this epic tale of the life of Conan the Barbarian and of the Hyborian Age. As you read the Conan stories, you might find that some things seem kind of familiar. And this is not by accident. Robert E. Howard himself was a huge history buff and put a lot of his own knowledge of world history into his stories as he wrote. If we look at Robert E. Howard's Hyborian Age essay, which is the primary source for information in this video, we get some clear examples of him doing this. So we've already established that Robert E. Howard's love for history influenced his fiction writing. But you might be wondering, where in history exactly does Conan the Barbarian take place? Could it be that Robert E. Howard's Conan stories actually have some historical fact and accuracy to them? Well, no, but also yes. You see, the Hyborian Age essay starts with a little disclaimer, you might say, from Robert E. Howard himself, explaining that the essay is purely a fictional history for a fictional world, that it is not meant to replace or be in coordination with any form of actual accepted history. That being said, this does come across more as a disclaimer that he might have felt obligated to put in there so that people didn't take his writing too seriously. But that doesn't mean that there aren't still real historical elements present in these stories. There's actually quite a bit. Now look, Conan the Barbarian is fictional fantasy. There's nothing else to it. There's no debating it. That's what it is. But Robert E. Howard's Hyborian Age, the time and setting in which these stories take place, resides on a particular point in the Earth's history that really is before our written historical records started. By placing his setting right here at this particular point in time, it allowed Robert E. Howard to have essentially unlimited creative freedom with his stories. And you might be asking, why then would he even bother placing it on Earth in the first place rather than making a completely fictional world like, say, Brandon Sanderson novels or something like that? Well, because he chose to place it on our planet, on our Earth, it allows him to pull things from history to create a richer and more believable setting than maybe we might see in some other fantasy writing. If you create a completely original world, original setting with its own magic system and all of this stuff, you have to do a lot of extra work to try and get the reader to believe what they're reading. You have to set up a whole host of rules for how things work in this fictional universe that makes it believable. Robert E. Howard, on the other hand, decided to place it in our world, in our universe, which is already doing a little bit of the legwork for him. That being said, this creates a new challenge where Robert E. Howard couldn't just start writing crazy fiction fantasy necessarily in this point. He had to think about real world history and figure out how he can fit it in there in a way that is also believable. This can create some of its own issues because we already have sort of an understanding of the history of the real world, and he is writing fantasy fiction that fits in there somewhere, which could also create a problem of the reader not believing it. Yet, Robert E. Howard did his homework and was a true history nerd and managed to do this seamlessly, creating an age in our history that is undocumented, completely fictional, yet completely believable. The Hyborian Age essay was written by Robert E. Howard and basically placed in a series of writings as a submission to a publisher, to one of the magazines that, I don't remember if this particular one that he sent it to accepted and published him or if they did not, but I think they did. This was a way to sort of explain what exactly is going on in Conan the Barbarian Barbarian, where we're at in history, and build the world. Now, you might realize like a lot of things are familiar in these stories, yet also it does look and feel like a different world when you look at the map and stuff. It's familiar yet foreign. Well, there's a very good reason for this, and the Hyborian Age essay breaks it all down. What we get from this is a series of rises and falls of humanity with both evolution and devolution. Is that a word? Devolution? Reverse evolution, whatever you would call it, of humanity, where there are periods where humans have turned into these large, humans have advanced to the point of having these large empires and kingdoms, and then fallen back down to the point of barbarism and even lower at some points. This cycle repeats itself over and over in Robert E. Howard's history for Conan the Barbarian. This is an idea that, while not talked about a ton in the scientific community, is relatively plausible. We have evidence of forms of evolution scientifically, and we have evidence of the advancement of humanity, but I don't know as though we can necessarily say that humanity had not been more advanced at one point in history than it was in some of the other points we look at where they are less advanced. It is very plausible and possible that our real history resembles this, and I'm not suggesting that this is fact. I'm just saying it is a realistic possibility that humanity could have gone from being essentially ape men to eventually having kingdoms and societies, and then going back to barbarism and back up. And this is a very realistic and plausible idea. In the context of the Conan the Barbarian stories, we see this through the rise of Atlantis and through Volusia, a part of Atlantis which another of Robert E. Howard's popular characters, Cole the Conqueror, was actually the king of Volusia. And essentially this is the predecessor to Conan the Barbarian. In fact, Robert E. Howard even adapted some of these Cole stories to later use them as Conan the Barbarian stories. We see this with the Phoenix and the Sword. It used to be called something else, and it was a story about Cole. Now, Conan himself, a Cimmerian, is a descendant of the Atlanteans, a very distant descendant after Cataclysm has already taken place and Atlantis has disappeared. And we see these cycles in the Hyborian Age of this destruction and rebuilding, where not only do these civilizations collapse and then form again, but also the land itself goes through similar cycles. The continent that we're familiar with when we read Conan, the very same one that features Hyperborea and Stygia and Aquilonia and all of these places that we're familiar with, this was formed after cataclysms had already transpired, and cataclysms happen again afterward, turning the world into something more resembling the one that we're familiar with today in our real life. We see how mountains sink below sea level to create islands. We see how communities of these peoples in the Conan stories eventually intermingle and mix to become the cultures and peoples that we see today in our world. One example that's highly discussed in the Hyborian Age essay is the Picts, and this is a people in the Conan stories and in the Hyborian Age essay who has undergone its own cycle of rising and falling to different levels of civilization and society, but largely their growth has been stunted to the point where they are pretty much stuck at the barbarianism level or even just a bit below in the Conan stories. Because of this, they are a serious problem for the Cimmerians, who are maybe a little bit more developed than the Picts. But the Hyborian Age essay does go on to explain how the Picts do eventually become the peoples that we are familiar with today, Scotland and Britannia, the Brits. This is, from what I remember, explicitly said in the Hyborian Age essay, and the Picts that we think of in history were the inspiration for Robert E. Howard's Picts. A quick internet search, however, suggests that the Picts eventually went on to become indigenous Americans after migrating westward. But to be clear, I do not remember reading this in the Hyborian Age essay, so I'm not entirely sure that that's accurate to Robert E. Howard's writing. If any of you guys know that, however, please let me know in the comments below, because I'm a little confused on this point after I did a Google search to refresh my memory, and I thought, I don't remember reading that. I thought that pretty clearly the Hyborian Age essay said that they went on to be the Scots and the Brits. Anyway, it is this time on the historical timeline after Atlantis has sunk beneath the oceans and before our historical written record started, where Conan the Barbarian takes place. This is the Hyborian Age. This is another point where I feel that Robert E. Howard's writing connects to real-world history. There is a large gap in our written record of history, a large period of time where we do not have writing and documentation from this era. It's very possible that something similar to this could have been taking place at the time, with our land masses looking drastically different species of animals walking the earth, and different cultures of peoples and whatnot at the same time. There could have been advanced societies existing at that time, which eventually were destroyed or restructured or whatever it could be through cataclysm. This is a popular idea in alternate history today. And in fact, Atlantis itself is a topic of discussion, where in the Conan stories, Atlantis is treated as an actual historical place where the Sumerians and other peoples descended from the Atlanteans, and this was this great civilization that existed at one point. But it looks a lot different than some of the interpretations we see these days about Atlantis. Rather than having advanced technology and all this sort of flying vehicles and stuff, it was really a lot more like groups of barbaristic peoples. This idea that Atlantis really existed is not crazy. In fact, many historians today and archaeologists entertain the idea that Atlantis could have been a real place. We have documentation, we have inscriptions in stone in both Egypt and in South America that suggest there was a legitimate Atlantis, that it was not just purely a myth told by Plato. And in fact, Plato's grandfather is actually the one who passed that story on to Plato, and he got the story from an inscription on stone in Egypt. There was a lot of crossover between ancient Egypt and Greece, so it's not completely ridiculous to think that Plato's grandfather would have gotten this information from Egypt. The Hyborian Age essay also goes to describe how the land masses we're familiar with today, the continents we see, formed over time from this continent that we see in the Conan stories. Again, cataclysm took place, separating continents, merging continents together, and creating new land masses. This is another idea that's not completely crazy. In fact, many ancient cultures have stories of cataclysms and predictions of future cataclysms that were to have supposedly taken place. Now, popular science might not necessarily agree with all of this, but it does seem to agree with the idea of a significant flooding of the earth, an ice age, meteor storms, things like this that had cataclysmic events on the earth. If we put this together with ancient myths and stories, we get the idea that this could have been a very real phenomenon. In the Hyborian Age essay, we get the idea of what Conan is really about. I think there's some very central key themes to Conan's stories, one of which being brains versus brawn, or might versus magic, we could say in this context, because in Conan, brains is essentially takes the form of magic and sorcerers who try to do dark rituals for their pursuit of power, while Conan, on the other hand, represents raw nature and bronze. This being said, Conan is by no means stupid. He's actually a very wise and intelligent man, which I have a whole video discussing, which you guys can go and watch that one as well, the wisdom of Conan the Barbarian. But brains in this instance is a very different phenomenon from simply being wise and intelligent. It's really, if Conan was a sci-fi story, we would see it in the form of the use of modern technology. But because it's a fantasy tale, we get it in the form of magic and ritual. Another theme that goes right along with this one is the clash of civilization and nature, or barbarism. The Hyborian Age is a setting that has both large societies of people and kingdoms, as well as barbaric tribes that live off of nature and in union with nature. This is another one of the central conflicts of these stories, how these barbaric tribes are essentially more in tune with nature and live very differently from the people who live in the cities and kingdoms. Conan the Barbarian is one of these barbaric people, a Cimmerian. Often, people who have never read a Conan story think of Conan the Barbarian as being this brooding, angry, running around chopping people's heads off, just a stupid sort of jock type of character. But this could not be further from the truth. In fact, it's Conan's barbarism that actually lends itself to the fact that Conan himself is quite humble and grounded. Conan is wise, Conan is instinctual, he's very grounded, which is in stark contrast from many of the antagonists we see in these stories, who tend to be these sorcerers and wizards who are feeble, they tend to be like small people that are seeking power and immortality, doing evil, dark rituals, sacrificing innocent people to try and gain this power and immortality. Conan acts as the hero. Conan is the man who is just a one of nature. He is just purely human nature, nature of man, and even living in harmony with nature, as opposed to these dark sorcerers who are trying to bend nature to their will. For the people who don't understand Conan well, who don't know much about it and think that he is this jock type character, well, you're right. He is a Chad, essentially. He's a muscular, his physique, all this stuff. He's not emotional. He's very stoic. So in a lot of ways, you're right. But he's not the type of bully sort of character that you might be thinking of. In fact, Robert E. Howard and Conan, by extension, despise bullies. In fact, Conan is the character who stands up to the bullies. Often because of popular 80s and 90s movies, we think of bullies as being these muscular jock type characters. And for a lot of us, that was the case when we were young and in school. The funny thing is, this has shifted over time. A lot of us who might have been nerds growing up and been bullied, small, weak people, we grew up to start going to the gym and working on our physique and being healthy, and have become in some ways the Chads. Meanwhile, the bullies of today that we see in the younger generations tend to be more like feeble, and they resemble the bullies of the Conan stories a lot more. When I was growing up, being a nerd was uncool and you got made fun of for it. Today, it is the popular thing. Everyone sits and plays video games and watches cartoons and is a nerd, essentially. In Conan, these sorcerer characters act as the bullies that Conan is standing up to. These are feeble, small, often sometimes older men who are unhappy with life, unhappy with the world, and want to do everything they can to manipulate nature to their evil desires of immortality and power. Meanwhile, Conan the Barbarian is just a grounded man who lives life day by day, enjoying it for what it is. He's not trying to chase after something that he can't have, like these sorcerer types who are so desperate to get something that they don't have. Conan just lives day by day, taking it in, not wasting any time thinking too deeply on things that don't matter. He just lives. In the Hyborian Age essay, we get a long portion of it that discusses a picked warrior leader type character. I think his name is Gorm. Pretty sure that's what it was. Gorm was this chieftain of the Picts, and essentially what happens in this little story here in the Hyborian Age essay is that this I can't think of his name, and I apologize because this essay is so dense with information and it doesn't read like a normal story, so I have a little bit of time like recalling all the information. There's so much information in this essay that there's no way I could possibly get it all through in a video. I'm just trying to hit the key points. But essentially, one of these civilized men from one of the civilizations goes to the Picts and manages to, in some ways, befriend them and sort of stay and live among them for a period of time without being killed. This man is a priest, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, who worships Mitra, and he tries to get the Picts to also follow and worship Mitra. This just shows an example of one of these civilized people going to these barbaric societies and trying to civilize them. But again, there's so much information in this essay. I would have to read it probably 5 more times to get more points remembered. But what you need to know as someone who is getting into Conan the Barbarian is that the stories take place on our world at the time between the sinking of Atlantis and before recorded history. This is a period when the land masses of the earth look very different and eventually change to what we know today as a result of repeated cataclysmic events. And in this time period, there's a combination of both barbaric tribes and civilized societies. Some of these kingdoms that are present at the time include Aquilonia, Stygia, Zingara, but we can focus on Aquilonia here as the example because as you start to get into Conan the Barbarian, Aquilonia is eventually going to become very important, and those of you who are already big fans of the series know why that is. So pay attention to Aquilonia. In this time period, there is not only these barbaric tribes and societies, but there is also magic and sorcery. And this is what really makes it fantasy at the end of the day. It's like sci-fi, but instead of technology, we have sorcery and ritual, which creates just such a rich setting for these stories. It's also another thing that is kind of a little believable to real history. Although we don't have anything to suggest that real magic actually exists in any capacity, a lot of the modern technology and conveniences we have today at one point in history were seen as magic. In addition to this, there are many religions across our modern world, and there were many, many more religions throughout history. Within these religions, there are always what you might call fanatics of the religion who very strongly believe in these supernatural forces and gods and demons and other entities. And many people alive even today do believe that something similar to magic or sorcery is a real thing as a result of these powers that exist beyond ourselves. This, of course, gives a lot of credibility and believability to the fantasy and fiction of Conan the Barbarian, where these sorcerers are communing with the gods and the demons for these rituals. I think those are most of the important points of the Hyborian Age essay, and so I hope that this video can help any of you guys who are interested in getting into Conan the Barbarian to have a better basis of getting started. I know it can be a little confusing because there's so many Conan stories and they jump around and take place at different points in his life, but hopefully this will give you a little bit of a foundation to start on to just sort of understand what exactly is going on in this time and setting in Conan. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. I got to do a quick shout out to my patrons. Thank you so much, Austin Brown, Grand Justiciar tier member of the Patreon, as well as Nate, who is Wizard tier. You guys have been huge support for the comic series. I hope you're enjoying it. And for the rest of you, for only $3 a month, you can subscribe to my Patreon, which gets you access to monthly releases of my original comic series, Hollow Point, as well as shout outs in all of these videos and in future issues of the comic. I also just want to show you guys, this is my second novel that I've written called Wrath of Torak. And the funny thing about this is I wasn't a Conan fan when I started this novel, but I did have the idea of this barbarians versus sword and sorcery type of character in my head. When I started writing this, I decided to go and give Conan a try as a way to get some inspiration for my novel. And I fell in love with the Conan series through that process, and that's what led to me being a Conan fan today. If you're also a fan of Conan and you want some new literature to read that's in a similar style, a similar feel, head on over to Amazon and get yourself a copy of Wrath of Torak. All you got to do is just search the title or my name, Austin Buffington, and you'll find it. We got beautiful hardcover editions like this on there, but there's also cheaper paperback versions and stuff. But I would love to hear from some of you guys after you read this book, what you think of it. And so definitely head on over and check that out. If you guys are new to the channel and you're fans of Conan the Barbarian, obviously hit the like button, but by crom, subscribe, because there's going to be a whole host of more Conan the Barbarian videos coming out on this channel. You guys seem to love them, and so I'm going to keep making them. So your subscription will help support me in making more Conan the Barbarian videos for you. I'm glad people like this stuff because I love it. Anyway, I'll see you guys in the next video.